G-Man Boxing. Do you know what I mean? Every single live he donates. I see him on other lives donating. He's got the bag on it.
Alright people, for those new to the channel, it's been a while since I've done a full-blown WTF video, right? Why am I doing this? It's kind of a career review / critique of a career. Normally tends to be people who started off good or big things were expected. We talk about their careers, we talk about their highs, and we talk about their lows. And in this video, I'm thinking, how did we get from the undisputed heavyweight champion, baddest man on the planet, to...
I broke my back.
What do you mean by that? You
My back is broken.
What, a vertebrae or
Well,
what portion?
Spinal.
Big right hand by Danny. Oh, no, I got him. Off the ropes and down to the canvas. It's Mike Tyson.
Well, we're going to take a look. We're going to take a look. We're going to talk about his career. We're going to talk about several fights. We're going to ask ourselves the question, people. What the fuck happened to Mike Tyson? So we're going to talk about Mike Tyson. We're going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about the start of his career, some of his amateur, highlights, his early days with Cus D'Amato. We're just going to talk about everything, basically, as well as his career, obviously. But, Mike Tyson was obviously born in New York City. He lost his mother at a very young age, was discovered by Cus D'Amato. Now, Mike Tyson, early on in his youth, was actually seen as, easy target. He had a kind of shyish voice. He wasn't exactly the most out there type of guy, but he had a fuse. He had a fuse that was well and truly triggered when a bully, I think he would have been about 10, got a pigeon, because Mike Tyson loves pigeons even to this day, and cracked the pigeon's neck, killed it. Now, one got to ask the question, what kind of freak does that? Yeah, that's a really, really sick thing to do. I mean, take bullying out of the equation, that's a really, really sick thing to do. But Mike Tyson flew into a fit of rage and beat him badly. Now, Mike Tyson was getting into trouble a lot at that stage, until Cus D'Amato found him. And under Cus D'Amato, after his mother passed away, Cus D'Amato was basically Mike Tyson's legal guardian. Cus D'Amato was like a father figure to Mike Tyson. And what he would do is he would show Mike Tyson highlights of the older generation of boxers, specifically heavyweights. Some of Mike Tyson's favourite fighters were Jack Dempsey, specifically him. He really loved Jack Dempsey. He even said it himself, Jack Dempsey's one of his favourites. But he's seen guys like Jack Dempsey, Max Baer, Muhammad Ali, guys like that, and he was fixated by these destructive guys. Like Jack Dempsey had a reputation as being a very destructive puncher. He had a lot of first round knockouts. Jack Dempsey would go in and he would feel as though, especially with a heavyweight, that the best time to get them is early on. So Jack Dempsey had a host of first round knockouts. You go and look at Jack Dempsey's career, and a lot of his fights, he's probably had more fights than are listed, because back then a lot of the records weren't kept. So Jack Dempsey probably had a lot more fights than were actually listed, and he went for just broke from the opening bell. Mike Tyson loved all that. He was fixated by them punchers. It actually got into his head at one stage throughout it. He spoke about this openly, that he looked at people like Max Baer, who had killed people in the ring, and he wanted to be like, he wanted a body. He admitted himself, he wanted to kill someone in the ring. When he fought Jesse Ferguson, who we'll talk about later on, that was his goal. He was trying to, in his own words, drive Jesse Ferguson's nose bone up into his brain to try and kill him. Now, obviously, after Mike Tyson's career ended, thankfully he didn't kill anyone. He said that he was glad at the end that he didn't. But let's just look at his amateur career. Alright, now, Mike Tyson, as a young amateur, Teddy Atlas spoke about this before, and he said that for the most part, when you have amateurs coming up, alright, if you have someone who's a little bit older, you're maybe trying to get them to maybe lie about their age to make them younger than they are. With Tyson, no one believed he was the age he was, because he did not look like your typical 12-13 year old. He looked like a man. He literally looked like a man, a fully grown man at that age. There were 12 years, 1981. How old would Mike Tyson have been in 1981? He would have been quite young. He's 55 now, so yeah, he would have only been a teenager at that time. He doesn't look like any teenager I've ever seen. He literally looks like a man. in this picture in 1981. You'll see it on screen there. Yeah, they really had a job. And Mike Tyson, early on in his amateur career, he was just walking through people. To be honest with you, he was really just, not that Mike Tyson wasn't good. You could see the speed was there from early on. You could see the talent that he had was there from early on. But like, Mike Tyson was overpowering these guys. I mean, there's a very famous story of Lennox Lewis and Mike Tyson sparring. Lennox Lewis, I think, would have been about 15, 16. Lennox Lewis looked, if I can find the picture, I'll pop it up on screen. But Lennox Lewis looked every bit his 15, 16 years. He looked like a tall, skinny teenager. Mike Tyson did not look like a little skinny teenager. He looked like a man. Alright, and he knocked Lennox Lewis out the ring. Admit it, that happened. He knocked Lennox Lewis out the ring in their first spar. Lennox Lewis did come back after that, and he wasn't knocked out again. He wasn't. There's also the infamous spar with Evander Holyfield before the Olympic trials. It was in 1984. Holyfield would have been a light heavyweight at that time. Now, light heavyweight in the amateurs today is 178 pounds. I don't know if it was 178 pounds in the 80s. I suspect it probably was. So he was giving up a lot of weight to Mike Tyson, and he went in there, sparred Mike Tyson, only went around. Holyfield more than held his own, and a very ferocious spar. That was a precursor of what was to come. Evander Holyfield, I think thereafter, was really obsessed with Mike Tyson. He really wanted to have a fight, in the pro games. Now, it says here that Mike Tyson's amateur record is 48 wins, 6 losses, 38 knockouts. No one has a definitive, accurate Mike Tyson. Some say it's more, some say it's less, but he did do some decent things in the amateurs. He only ever had one stoppage loss, and it was to a guy called Al Evans. Interesting thing here is Mike Tyson's at that age was 16 years old, so he was stopped at 16. Al Evans was 27 years old. Alright, so Mike Tyson, when he was starting out very early on, he was just overpowering the guys who were his own age. When he started fighting guys at senior level, that's when he started having a bit of trouble, because he was basically a man at 16 fighting boys. So when it came to him fighting actual real men, 27 years old, this guy Al Evans was, so 11 years older, he started having a few little bits of issue along the way. One of his nemesis from the amateurs was a guy called Henry Tillman. Now, Henry Tillman was older than Tyson. He was a big guy. I think he ended up going on to win. He won Olympic. Did he win a gold or was it silver? But he done very well in the Olympics, and that was a heavyweight, not super heavyweight, heavyweight. Now, he beat Mike Tyson twice in the amateurs. Now, was it the first fight? It was one of them. It was one of the fights. I think it might have been the first one. I don't think it was the Olympic box-off. I think it might have been the first one, where Mike Tyson dropped Henry Tillman, but Henry Tillman was actually able to get the win, because Henry Tillman basically ran around the ring. He kind of just kept his distance at that point and just was able to pick shots at Mike Tyson and win a points decision that way. Amateur boxing is very different to pro boxing. They very seldom tend to, if you're, let's use an example. If you were talking about a very close fight, Kid Galahad versus Josh Warrington, chances are, if that was scored in their amateur system, they would have given that to Kid Galahad by a long way, because that's really what they go for in amateur boxing. They're very much sticklers in amateur boxing. They're very much sticklers for technique as well. You could be winning a round clearly in a pro ring, although it could be an amateur, but in terms of pros, they could be winning it clearly. But if someone lands a couple of shots on you and they throw in with the right technique, a hook thrown exactly the way they want, they're probably giving that round. Amateur boxing is very different scoring criteria than pro boxing. Very different. Now, Mike Tyson turned pro in March of 1985. Okay, now he turned pro in March of 1985. He was world champion come November of 1986. That's a very, very quick turnaround. All right. But the interesting thing about Mike Tyson's early career is how often he was out fighting. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable when you think about it. We talk about guys nowadays, young prospects turning over. If they have 5 fights in a year, that's seen as very, very good. You've been kept busy that year. If you have more than 5 fights, 6 fights, you're doing very well. Even before, what's happening now, even like 2018, 2019, that was seen as quite good. In Ireland, if you even got 2 fights, 3 fights in a year and you were just turning pro, that's amazing. Mike Tyson was fighting, even by 80 standards, because back then they did get guys out a lot more, but even by the standards of the 80s, it's quite remarkable how often Mike Tyson was out when you look at his resume and you look at his box record, you look at the dates. Twice a month sometimes, 3 times a month sometimes in some instances. It's crazy. And Mike Tyson, when he turned pro, he had a team around him. He had guys like Jimmy Jacobs, Bill Caton, Cus D'Amato. Teddy Atlas was training him in the amateurs, but after an incident, I think Mike would have been about 15, 16, after an incident involving Atlas's daughter, Atlas was removed from the camp. Teddy Atlas has spoken about that. I don't need to go into it, just for YouTube reasons. But you probably, if you listen to Teddy Atlas explain it, it involved Teddy Atlas's daughter. It involved a gun, and yeah, you know, he'll probably explain that better than I ever could. So he was turning pro with Kevin Rooney training him. Now, made his pro debut against a guy called Hector Mercedes. That's on YouTube. Every single one of Mike Tyson's fights has been televised or filmed, apart from one, which I'll talk about now in a sec. And the reason I'll talk about that one specifically is because there's contrasting reports about that fight in terms of why it wasn't filmed. I'll touch on it now in 2 secs. But yeah, Hector Mercedes, Trent Singleton, Don Halpin, you know, I mean, he was bigger than a lot of these guys. You know, every single one of them he outweighed. Ricardo Spain, who was 1-0 at the time, came in with an unbeaten record. He got knocked out in 40 seconds. I think he went on to be a journeyman. Well, he definitely went on to be a journeyman. I don't think he had a good resume after that. John Aldridge, Larry Sims. So this was Mike Tyson's, how many fights were we in? This is his 6th pro fight against Larry Sims. This is the only fight that's never been recorded or never been filmed. There is an image of the fight, which you'll see there on screen, but no one knows definitively what happened. Now, there's contrasting reports about that fight as to why it wasn't filmed. Some have stated that the reason it wasn't filmed was quite simple, is that event, Mike Tyson was fighting too early in the card, and by the time the guys came to do the film for the event, his fight had already taken place. Another story, which is also reported, is that the fight was actually filmed. So there was footage of that fight, which was filmed at the time. However, Mike Tyson's team were looking to get him onto some, say, bigger networks, and we're looking to send footage of Mike Tyson, you know, into some of these networks. And if you see like the Hector Mercedes, the Trent Singleton, Don Halpin, they're all very good performers. They're all very exciting, explosive. Allegedly is that Mike Tyson didn't look particularly good against Larry Sims until he got rid of him, and they felt that, you know what, best to just dispose of this. We don't need it, because it's not going to do Mike Tyson any favors if we send this into some of the major networks. That's the 2 stories. I suspect it's probably somewhere in the middle. I suspect probably the fact was that I wasn't there. Joe Cortez was the referee. You know Joe Cortez. Remember, guys, I'm fair but I'm firm. He was the referee. I would love, if I ever met him, to ask him about that, because he refereed. Maybe he remembers it. There is a report on that fight from an observer who stated that the fight was very lackluster for the first 2 rounds until Mike Tyson went to Larry Sims' body, in which case Larry Sims brought his hands down and was hit by a right hand, which knocked him out cold. Again, that's just what's being reported. Until we see, we're never probably going to see footage of the fight, or if Mike Tyson ever wants to. I'd just like to know what happened in that fight. But yeah, that's the only fight of Mike Tyson's pro career we don't have footage of. Lorenzo Concedi, yeah, that was Joe Cortez stopped that fight early, very early. Concedi was Concedi's. I'm just gonna say Concedi's. He was 3-0, but he was way out of his depth against Mike Tyson, way out of his depth. Michael Johnson, I probably have seen that fight, but I just don't remember it. Donnie Long, I think I remember seeing that fight. Robert Clayton, Sterling Benjamin. You know, he's feasting on these guys. They're just journeymen. But at this stage, when he fought Sterling Benjamin, he'd been pro for, at the time, just over 7 months. What was Mike Tyson's record at that stage? So you bear in mind, we've got a pro here who's pro 7 months, and he's already 10-0. That's quite remarkable. Eddie Richardson, I remember seeing that fight on YouTube. The first right hand Mike Tyson throws, he sends Eddie Richardson flying, follows up with another right hand, sends him absolutely flying. I mean, he was sending him all over the ring, Eddie Richardson. I remember watching that fight. Conroy Nelson, that's an interesting fight, Conroy Nelson. Not because it was actually particularly competitive, it wasn't, but it's one of the worst kind of recordings of a fight you'll ever see, because it was filmed and commentated on. It almost looks like by a phone, even though they weren't using the phone. But the commentary setup in that fight, if you've ever seen it, it was like they were in the crowd. So it's like that the commentators are actually, but imagine You know what press row is? Imagine press row, but like 2 rows back behind the fans. That's kind of what it looked like, and that the camera is there basically. So you had a really, really poor view of it, and a commentator trying to commentate on it. And every time Mike Tyson would throw a shot, the fans would get up off their feet. So it was really, really hard to see. I think that fight's still on YouTube, if memory serves me correct. Sammy Scaff, remember that fight? Big, tall beanpole of a guy, 250 pounds. I think that's the guy Mike Tyson knocked out with the right hand. I mean, they showed that in a lot of Mike Tyson's highlight reels. Mark Young. Was Mark Young the guy who got hit with the uppercut? I remember Mike Tyson threw an uppercut, and Mark Young, I think, is the guy. It's on YouTube, and it's a weird one. It like skims him. It lands, but it kind of partially lands, but it shows the force on it, and he just goes down. You know, David Jaco, Mike Jameson, however you pronounce it, 5th round TKO. That was the longest Tyson ever got into a fight at that stage. Whoo boy, that right there, that was a horrible fight for Mike Jameson. I mean, he really took an almighty. I don't think I've seen someone take as bad a beating as that. That was horrendous. Because Mike Tyson could not put a dent in him for the first 3 rounds, and he was hitting him with everything but the kitchen sink. And Jameson, I think he's only ever been stopped a couple of times, like a handful of times. And he was not hard to find, he was not hard to hit, but he really took a serious beating in that fight. Serious beating, he really did. And referee Joe Cortez refereeing a lot of these fights, stopped that fight. Jesse Ferguson. Now, interestingly, right, Mike Tyson would have been pro just under a year at this stage. That was his fight with Jesse Ferguson. Now, what would he have been? I'm just going to check and see what his record was going into the Jesse Ferguson fight. He was 17-0. Now, that fight also had Mike Weaver versus Carl the Truth Williams on that card, right? Now, interestingly, the original opponent, which was listed, what was supposed to be at the time, was actually Carl the Truth Williams. They were talking about putting him in there instead of Jesse Ferguson. Obviously, it ended up being Jesse Ferguson. It was a decent little scrap. Famous uppercut to the body, and then right hook to the body, uppercut to the head by Mike Tyson, or was it left? It was anyway, hook to the body, uppercut to the head, trying to drive Jesse Ferguson's nose bone through his skull. Jesse Ferguson took a hell of a beating, and after that he got up. A lot of people think that was the knockout shot. It wasn't. Jesse Ferguson actually got up at that point, but he was in a real bad way, and for the rest of the fight he just held to the point where he was actually disqualified. Now, it's listed as a TKO, right? It shouldn't have been. It was a DQ, right? But because Mike Tyson had a very, very good KO streak, and he had a really impressive KO streak going at this time, they lobbied the New York State Athletic Commission, his team, to get that overturned to a TKO, because they wanted to have Mike Tyson having a really, really big KO streak. I've not seen any other instances where they've done that, to be honest with you. I know when F.A. Ajagba fought Curtis Harper a couple of years ago, and Harper walked out of the ring for the bell, just after the bell actually, that was a DQ. They tried to get that changed to a TKO. It didn't work, but it did in this sense. He fought a guy named Steve Zouski. Steve Zouski was a journeyman. I know Steve Zouski. He was actually George Foreman's comeback opponent. So when George Foreman made his comeback after 10 years, it was Steve Zouski he fought, and Zouski took a hell of a beating in that fight. His face was an absolute bloody mess, and Mike Tyson was able to get through him. Steve Zouski was meant to be a decent enough amateur, but like as a pro he never did anything, and he was, a journeyman, but tough. He was tough. Then there kind of came the first real challenge, we'll say, of Mike Tyson's career. Was against a guy called James Tillis, 31-8. So not a particularly great resume. James Tillis had been beaten before, been stopped before, had been hurt badly by lesser punchers like Tyrell Biggs. Tyrell Biggs beat the living crap out of James Tillis. But he gave Mike Tyson a real competitive fight. At this time of boxing, the scoring criteria wasn't different, but we know the 10-point must system. At one stage there was like 3 different must systems. Some people used the 5-point must system, like in the 60s. The 10-point must system was there as well, or the round system. The round system is just basically like, imagine a 115, 113 scorecard, 7 rounds to 5. That's kind of how it was, and that's what they did in this fight. But very competitive, like 6-4, 6-4, 8-2. Tillis was down, so if you wanted to count it as a 10-8 round, if you were to do it by today's criteria, it would be 96, 93, 96, 93, 98, 91 in terms of the scorecards. Competitive enough. Tyson, and the knockdown was more a balance shot, to be fair, in the 4th round by Tillis. Tillis had a lot of success in there against Mike Tyson. Was not his best performance. Potentially could have been a sense of maybe he was overtrained because he was fighting an awful lot. He was back out only 2 weeks later against Mitch Green. Now this fight right here, Mitch Blood Green, absolute nut job, psycho. God knows what he was on. Mitch Green was crazy. He really was. And Mitch Green was a gang leader was it in Brooklyn or was it in Harlem? It was some area in New York anyway. It might have been Harlem. And Mike Tyson obviously was in a gang as well, and these two guys knew each other from the streets. And Mitch Blood Green, as he was known, very limited, couldn't punch. If you see Mike Tyson was taking the piss at some stage in that fight because he was just moving his head and Mitch Green couldn't land. He was throwing real slapping shots, but Mike Tyson didn't really put a dent in Mitch Green. Mitch Green was very tough. I say God knows what he was on because you wouldn't know with him whether he was on something in that fight or not. Seriously, Mitch Green was crazy. He really was. And there was actually times after that fight where he actually confronted Mike Tyson in New York a couple of times. And I think one of the times Mitch Green ended up getting getting hit by Mike Tyson. And there was another time. I think it was definitely more than once, but I think there was only one time where Mike Tyson actually swung from Mitch Green. Yeah, Mitch Green was crazy, absolutely crazy. He's still alive, but yeah, Mitch Blood Green. So they were his 2 fights back to back, 2 10-round UDs, which ended the KO streak. But he got it back straight away in the 1st round against Reggie Gross. I have seen that fight, but off the top of my head, I can't actually remember how the knockout came about. William Jose, 1st round knockout. Lorenzo Boyd. Mike Tyson was really trying to hurt Lorenzo Boyd real bad because Lorenzo Boyd's actually a cop by trade. Well, he's dead now, RIP. So Mike Tyson really wanted to punish him. Marvis Frazier knocked him out in 30 seconds. I think that might have been Mike Tyson's quickest knockout. Yeah, Marvis Frazier, the son of Joe Frazier, he had none of his dad's talent. He was 16-1 at the time, and that one loss was against Larry Holmes for the world title, and Larry Holmes beat him in clinical fashion as well. Marvis Frazier was just not that good. He was just not that good. Mike Tyson charged at him, knocked him out cold. I think he knocked him out with a right hand, absolutely levelled him. Marvis Frazier should never have been in the ring with Mike Tyson. Should never have been in the ring with Larry Holmes. Realistically, he shouldn't have been in the ring in general. He was just not good. He had the name of Frazier. Joe Frazier was his dad, but Marvis Frazier was just, he just wasn't that good. Should never have been in the ring with Mike Tyson. Jose Rabota, Mike Tyson beat the crap out of him over 10 rounds. By the end of the fight, he could have probably carried on to the end, but the referee saw pity on him and stopped that fight. And then he won more fight against Alphonses Ratliff, so you pronounce that, before going in there against Trevor Berbick. Now, Mike Tyson, youngest heavyweight champion of all time. Now, he took the record of youngest heavyweight champion off Floyd Patterson. Floyd Patterson was also trained by Cus D'Amato. And Floyd Patterson won a vacant title against Archie Moore. Now, Archie Moore, great light heavyweight, had seen better days when he fought Patterson. I mean, Moore was close to 40, or might even been 40 when he fought Patterson. Patterson was only 21. Now, Berbick was 31-4-1, and he was not a particularly strong fighter. He had been knocked out before. I think it was Bernardo Machado knocked him out in a round. There's no footage of that fight. He had lost very decisively to Larry Holmes in a crack at the world title. Trevor Berbick was a really poor champion. He really was. Infamous for ending the career of Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali should have been nowhere near the ring at that time. He had Parkinson's at the time. It was 1981 going into 82, I think it was. In fact, I'm pretty sure, it was 81. And Ali shouldn't have been anywhere near the ring. And he was able to win rounds in there against Berbick, which, that Ali had no business being anywhere near a boxing ring. In fact, Ali, 4 years prior, had no business being anywhere near a boxing ring. Let that sink in. Now, he didn't win the fight, Ali. Berbick did win it, but Ali was competitive enough, which it shows. And, Muhammad Ali, great fighter, but at that stage, he shouldn't have been anywhere near the boxing ring. Now, Mike Tyson, to his credit, he won the world title, WBC, off Berbick, but Berbick was one of the worst heavyweight champions of all time. He was. Make no mistake about it. I mean, if you took a 20-year-old Riddick Bowe, he would have beat Trevor Berbick. 20-year-old Muhammad Ali, he would have beat Trevor Berbick. If you took, I was going to say a 20-year-old Deontay Wilder, but Wilder at 20, I think he was still an amateur. But let's just say, like, who do we have now? I mean, Daniel Dubois. You can give Daniel Dubois a stick, but you give him a good chance over Berbick. Seriously, Berbick was very poor heavyweight champion, extremely limited, extremely poor. That too, Mike Tyson beat for the WBC title. Berbick fought a brave fight, he did, but he just didn't have the punch resist. He didn't have a terrible chin, did Berbick, but he was not able to take Mike Tyson shots the way he was fighting. He just had no defense, and Mike Tyson, famously the right hand, Berbick just couldn't get his legs back, and that was all she wrote. Youngest heavyweight champion of all time. Mike Tyson's next fight was a unification against James Bone Crusher Smith. Horrible fight, don't watch it. If you want to go to sleep, watch the fight, but if you want to be entertained, don't watch the fight. Hugfest. Smith should have been disqualified. He really should have. It did show that you could neutralise Mike Tyson, though. That's one thing. Like, Smith was able to neutralise what Mike Tyson had by just keeping him, whenever Mike Tyson would get close, he would hold him, he would grab on for dear life. Bit like, in fact, Povetkin against Klitschko, that was worse. Now, that shows how bad the Klitschko-Povetkin fight was, because that was worse. I have seen, from my sins, I have seen this fight, James Smith versus Mike Tyson, in its entirety, as I said, for my sins. But, and I can tell you from first glance, it is not as bad as Klitschko-Povetkin. Now, that just shows how bad that fight was. It's not as bad as that, but both guys should have been disqualified, Klitschko and Smith, for what they did in both fights respectively. But yeah, Mike Tyson, he couldn't really land anything on Smith. Smith was never even close to being hurt. The only person wobbled in the fight was actually Mike Tyson in the 12th round. He wasn't seriously hurt around that, was more right hand, but he felt it, and he moves on. Then he fought Pinklin Thomas. Pinklin Thomas was 29-9 at the time, former world champion. Pinklin Thomas at this time was having some issues. I think it was crack cocaine he was having issues with at the time. He was having drug issues at the time, was Pinklin Thomas. Pinklin Thomas was a good fighter. He was tough, he had a good jab, he was athletic, but against Mike Tyson he was really outmatched. And you guys want to see a tremendous beating, you go and watch Pinklin Thomas versus Mike Tyson. He took a tremendous beating in that fight. He really, really did. Took a hell of a beating, especially in the first round. I don't think I've ever seen someone take so many shots in the first round and not go down. It's actually quite remarkable, really. I mean, the doctors were checking on him, Pinklin Thomas, after the first round, and it's on that fight. I think is on YouTube. If it's not on YouTube, you'll find it on Daily Motion. I remember watching it months ago now. I remember having a little sneak peek a couple of months back at some of Mike Tyson's fights, and Angelo Dundee was training Pinklin Thomas for that fight, and he was screaming his little heart out at the ringside physicians trying to check on Pinklin Thomas. But yeah, that's the beating he took in the first round. He was eventually taken out in the 6th. Mike Tyson then would go on to become undisputed in August of 1987 against Tony Tucker, who was undefeated at the time. Tony Tucker was a very, very good boxer, technically was very good. He had the IBF title, which he'd won from James Buster Douglas. The IBF title, which was vacated, or stripped I should say, from one Michael Spinks. I had to think there for a sec. But yeah, it was stripped from Michael Spinks because basically there was a HBO kind of tournament to get undisputed. He didn't want to take part in it. He went on to fight Jerry Cooney instead, which was built as a lineal heavyweight title. And obviously Buster Douglas and Tony Tucker fought for the vacant title. Buster Douglas was winning that fight until he just ran out of steam and ran out of energy and ran out of heart in the 10th round, and was ultimately taken out by Tony Tucker. Tony Tucker started out this fight very well. He was outboxing Mike Tyson until he hurt, I think it was his right hand he hurt. He was a bit less effective from then on, but nevertheless he was able to survive the 12 rounds, 116, 112, 119, 111, 118, 113. So yeah, there was a lot of even rounds in there, because they did score more even rounds back in the 80s than they do now. They hardly ever do it nowadays. So yeah, you can kind of see how many nip and tuck rounds were there. Mike Tyson won the fight clearly, and I actually think that's a very good win. I think it's a very good win for Mike Tyson over Tony Tucker. It was a tricky fight, make no mistake about it, but Mike Tyson did what he needed to do. He did. Mike Tyson against taller guys, and I mean, like, most people were taller than Tyson. Tyson was 5'10". He was built at 5'11 and a half, which is just a shade under 6 foot. He was not that tall. Alright? Maybe it's because his boots weren't like normal boots. Like, boxing boots are so flat, except, well, nowadays most boxing boots are flat except Everlast. I have a pair of them when I used to box. I forget what they're called now, but they're the Everlast boots. Deontay Wilder wears them. The sole of them actually lifts a bit, but they're probably the exception. Mike Tyson would wear boxing boots that had big soles, which would give him a little bit more height. But for the most part, boxing boots are very flat. So when you're wearing them, I mean, you're feeling everything, because they're like slippers almost. Not literally, but that's kind of how thin they are. So Mike Tyson, very short, fighting guys like Tony Tucker, who were a lot taller, who could, just keep him at arm's length. Mike Tyson was known in his prime anyway with his opponents. The silent contract is what they called it. So Mike Tyson, Mike Tyson's kind of style was, right? We know what his style was. He was pick-a-boo kind of style. He would come in, be throwing some kind of fast counters. He would kind of pressure you to an extent. He'd get in under your shots. He'd come up underneath you, and he'd just let go very fast, explosive punches. Right, that's kind of Mike Tyson's style. How do you nullify that? Well, you keep him at arm's length. You tie him up when he gets in close. But what happened with a lot of fighters is when they get in close, they wouldn't work with Mike Tyson. So Mike Tyson, when he got into a clinch, sometimes he would use that to rest. And what other fighters would do is they'd be like, if I won't hit you, they wouldn't say this obviously, but it was kind of like the silent contract was, if I don't hit you, you don't hit me, and you can rest. That was how, when Mike Tyson lost, certainly in his prime, that's how the guys like Holyfield and Douglas beat him. They made him work when he didn't want to work, and then when he wanted to work, they wouldn't let him. That was a good way of how you beat Tyson. Now, the next fight he had was against a guy called Tyrell Biggs. Now, Biggs, there was a lot of fighters in the 80s who had problems with drugs. There was. And Tyrell Biggs was probably the worst in terms of the heavyweights. I mean, Biggs was 15-0 at this time, former Olympic gold medalist, but he really had serious crack cocaine problems. I mean, serious. I think they said that when he turned pro first, he was spending 1,500 quid a day just on crack cocaine. Biggs was a complete mess. He really was. When he turned pro, he didn't really have the style for the pro game. Like, Biggs was a mover. He wasn't really a puncher. He had a good amateur style. You can see how that style would be effective in the amateurs, but in the pro game, it just wasn't conducive to the pro game. It wasn't entertaining. He'd no killer instinct. I remember, was it Ronaldo Snipes he fought? And he dropped Ronaldo Snipes very heavily, Tyrell Biggs, and he couldn't finish him. And like, if you'd seen the knockdown, you'd think, this is over. The guy's getting up, but Biggs will finish him. He didn't finish him. He had a competitive fight with Ronaldo Snipes. It was, what was the guy's name? I'll have to box rec him now, because the fight before he actually fought Lorenzo Bird. But before that, he fought, who was it he fought that he looked terrible with? David Bay. So, 6-round TKO. And it was actually the Ronaldo Snipes fight before that. But yeah, he fought David Bay, and I remember watching that fight on YouTube, and oh my good lord, Biggs was getting absolutely battered from pillar to post. He was cut, he'd no legs, he couldn't move, and then he landed a right hand out of the blue and was able to finish off David Bay. I mean, his career hung on by a thread at that stage, but he had other issues as well. Like, he was in a car accident, I believe, as well, and he injured his arm in that. And Tyrell Biggs was a wash going into this Tyson fight. He should never, even in the David Bay fight, people were saying, why would they put him in with Mike Tyson? And people were saying they shouldn't do it. Well, they put him in because basically the promoters of Tyrell Biggs were the Duvas, was Dan and Dino. I think there was another one as well. But basically, they knew what they had in front of him. They had a guy who, if they put him in with Mike Tyson, can make a hell of a lot of money, and let's do it. Why would you do that to him? Because someone else was going to beat him. He made very hard work of Ronaldo Snipes. He nearly lost to David Bay. Better to cash him out against Tyson than have him lose against God knows who. And Biggs lost that fight to Tyson. He won the first round. See, Biggs, right? You saw hints in that Tyson fight of what Biggs could have been. Now, I'm not saying Biggs would have been a world beater or anything like that, or he would have been a great heavyweight champion. No. But Biggs could move for all of 2 rounds, and then his legs were gone. Now, if he could keep up, that was a 15 rounder as well, by the way. Now, if he could keep that up for 12, 15 rounds, could be pretty useful. He couldn't. His legs were literally gone after a round every fight, around 2 rounds max. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't move, right? And this is a 15-0 Tyrell Biggs. This is how washed he was by the time he fought Tyson. In fact, he might have been washed long before that. In fact, I suspect he probably was, because he just had so many issues outside the ring with injuries, crack cocaine, and stuff like that. Saying that, it was one of Tyson's best performances. Like, every round the judges gave to Tyson. Biggs won the first round. To be fair, he did. I gave him the first round, but that was it. After that, he was cannon fodder for Mike Tyson. He really was. Larry Holmes, he fought him then in January of 1988. I remember that fight well. Holmes had been retired for nearly 2 years. Don King told him he had 3 months to train. He only had a month. He said that he was drinking beer when he answered the door to Don King. And I remember seeing a ringside interview with Larry Holmes, and he said he'd no intention of fighting Mike Tyson. And then Don King said, "I'll give you 4 million quid," and he said, "I'll fight Mike Tyson." I remember him saying that. That was funny. But yeah, that was Mike Tyson, he knocked Larry Holmes clean out cold in that fight. I think Holmes' arm got caught on the rope when he was buzzed, and he was hit by a right hand, and that was the end of Larry Holmes. Now, Larry Holmes did go on to have a comeback as same bit similar to George Foreman. Although Foreman was able to pick up a title, Holmes didn't. Holmes would end up beating Ray Mercer, which was a very good win, and Holmes had a full training camp for that. He had hardly any training for this fight with Tyson, hardly any time to prepare. So I'm not saying he would have won. I don't think he would have, but it might have been a bit more interesting to see. I mean, a prime Larry Holmes against Tyson would be very interesting. Very good fight. Then he went to Japan, fought Tony Tubbs. I remember that fight well. Tony Tubbs, right? Here's a little bit of trivia for you about this fight. Tony Tubbs was 220 or 38 pounds. Tony Tubbs struggled with his weight, alright? And one of the rules that was in this was that he would get a bonus if he came in under 235 pounds. He didn't. He started off well, to be fair, he did. He started off quite well, Tony Tubbs against Mike Tyson. But he was ultimately caught with a left hook in the second round. Was all kinds of messed up. Referee stopped it quite rightly. Tony Tubbs could not continue. He was absolutely finished from the punch. Then we go to the pinnacle of Mike Tyson's career. Now, interestingly, on BoxRec, they have this listed as a 15-rounder. I'm pretty sure this was a 12-rounder against Michael Spinks. It says in round 1 of... I think BoxRec they all have these fights. These weren't 15-rounders. The Biggs fight was a 15-rounder. The Holmes wasn't. The Tubbs fight wasn't. The Spinks fight wasn't. So I think BoxRec might be a bit off with some of these 15-rounders. I'm sure they all... I know that... if you look up last 15-rounder in a heavyweight title fight, it will tell you it was Tyrell Biggs versus Tyson. This is just a little complaint about BoxRec, but look, we'll move on. Yeah, he fought Michael Spinks. Mike Spinks undefeated at the time, great light heavyweight, should not have been anywhere near Mike Tyson. People were still trying to say that Michael Spinks was the real heavyweight champion. Obviously, everyone in the world at the time knew Mike Tyson was the man, and he proved it. Absolutely destroyed Michael Spinks. Destroyed him in 90 seconds. Knocked him damn near out cold. That was the end of Michael Spinks. He retired thereafter, and Mike Tyson would go on then to fight Frank Bruno. I think it was after this time. I think it was after... Was it Bruno? Yeah, I think it might have actually been after Spinks was when he left Kevin Rooney. So obviously at this time Mike Tyson would have been with Robin Gibbons, Don King promoting them, kind of all that. Like, he was really... This was kind of... Some people would say this was when Mike Tyson was on the decline. I doubt that very much. Mike Tyson was still quite young at this stage. He was still athletic. In terms of him, like, some people say that he peaked at 21. You could say that, yeah, he was never going to get any better. But it wasn't like he peaked and it just went... It wasn't like that, He was still quite useful even after the Douglas fight. It's just that I don't think he improved from an athletic point of view or a physical point of view at that stage. Anyway, he fought Frank Bruno. Was it Reg Guttridge who said, "Get on him, Frank"? Was that who it was when Tyson wasn't... He buzzed him a little bit, I suppose, Frank Bruno in the first round. But was it Reg Guttridge who said, "Get on him, Frank"? I remember hearing that. I'm sure it was Reg Guttridge. If it wasn't, someone can feel free to correct me. It might have been him. But Frank Bruno done well, against Mike Tyson. Was ultimately stopped in the 5th round. Frank Bruno had a decent chin. I know he was stopped. I think he was stopped in all of his fights, but like Frank Bruno just had no real instinct to survive. A bit like Kovalev. Kovalev I don't think has the best chin, but when Kovalev would get hurt, he wouldn't know what to do. He would literally, like against Ward, he wouldn't know what to do. Against Aleta Alvarez didn't know what to do. Against who was the other guy? He was hurt against Yard. He didn't really know what to do. Although he did a bit better against Yard, to be fair, when he got hurt. But yeah, a bit like Kovalev, just had no real instinct for when he was hurt. Mike Tyson then beat Carl the Truth Williams. Carl Williams never really had a particularly good chin. Was beaten by Larry Holmes years prior for the world title. Carl the Truth Williams at that stage seen better days. Stopped in the first round. Lovely left hook from Mike Tyson. Lovely counter left hook, put him down. And he got back up. Some people would say that was a premature stoppage. It was Randy Newman was the referee in the fight. But Carl Williams had been beaten several times. He was kind of on the decline at that stage. And then we move into the 90s. The 1990s. February 11th to be exact, 1990. We go to Tokyo, Japan. And to quote the great Jim Lampley, the Japanese market are seemingly willing to pay for what American fans will not. Apparent mismatches for Mike Tyson. That was how that. I remember Jim Lampley saying that on the broadcast for that fight. I remember Larry Merchant said he was speaking to a journalist who arrived in Japan, and the journalist said he was there to cover the Tyson Douglas fight. And they said to him at the airport, well, how long do you expect to cover the Tyson Douglas fight? And he said, about 90 seconds. So you could see the kind of reputation that was going on in this. Mike Tyson at that stage was at the height, pinnacle. People feared. No one thought he could lose in any form of combat. They thought he was invincible. And James Buster Douglas was 28-4 and 1 draw. Had we been around the YTBC at that time, could you imagine our reaction if we'd found out Mike Tyson was fighting Buster Douglas? We'd be making videos up in arms. I can imagine Dell's reaction. You can just picture Del Boy, shout out to Blue Collar Sports TV, what he'd be saying if we were all around back then doing YouTube videos. On paper, looked a fairly run-of-the-mill fight for Mike Tyson. Didn't seem like it would be really any trouble for him whatsoever. Buster Douglas had a lot of things go wrong for him going into there. I mean, the week of the fight, he had the flu, back when you still could get flu. And, he was on all types of penicillin and stuff like that. And tragically, only a few weeks prior, his mother, who he was extremely close to, passed away. And that really, he promised his mother, because his mother at the time was worried, before she passed away, that he'd get hurt by Mike Tyson. And he said, I'm going to beat Mike Tyson. And she went around telling all of her friends, this is what Douglas himself said, that he's going to beat Mike Tyson. And it inspired James Buster Douglas. He really was inspired to go out. And by all accounts, he was absolutely smashing his sparring partners in preparation for this fight, destroying them. And then also, as well as that, what people forget is that the mother of James Douglas's child was diagnosed with an illness as well. So he had a terrible camp. People say at this time, going back to the Tony Tubbs fight, that's when they say Mike Tyson was out partying a lot. And Mike, they say that when he was in Tokyo, he didn't take Douglas serious at all. He was just going around partying. Not true. Mike Tyson said it himself, that he had a lot of sex with Japanese you-know-whats, but he was confined to his hotel room. Now, was Mike Tyson in the best shape he's ever been in? No, I've seen him in better shape before and since. But he wasn't out of shape. He wasn't in terrible shape. And instantly from the first bell, what Buster Douglas did, you could just see instantly, oh boy, there's a style issue there. He was able to keep Mike Tyson at bay with his jab. James Douglas had a very good, very powerful jab. Dropped people with that jab as well several times. I remember it was on one of Mike Tyson's undercards. Might have even been the Spinks undercard, or it was one of them anyway, where I forget who he was fighting. I forget who exactly he was fighting. He was fighting some kind of, I think he was a prospect, if memory serves me correct. I forget his name. But who the hell was I forget now, but dropped him a couple of times with a jab. So Douglas's jab was very powerful, and he kept Mike Tyson at bay, tied Mike Tyson up whenever he got close, made him work when he didn't want to, and literally for the first 8 rounds put on a clinic. The scorecards in this fight are absolutely ridiculous. absolutely disgraceful scorecards. I mean, let's look at it here. You've one scorecard who had the fight scored correctly, 88-82 to Buster Douglas, and even then, you could probably give that 8 round a 10-9 round to Mike Tyson because he was on the verge of getting stopped in that round. One judge has it a draw, and the other judge has Mike Tyson ahead. I mean, you could not look at Buster Douglas versus Tyson and score any other way than Buster Douglas every single round, apart from the 8th round, which was really against the run of play when Mike Tyson landed that uppercut and dropped Buster Douglas. People try and make out as though that was a long count. It wasn't, because if you look at Mike Tyson's count, they got the exact same counts. Go on YouTube and type in HBO Mike Tyson long count. You've Larry Merchant with Buster Douglas and Mike Tyson in the studio. They analyse it, same time. Referee in this fight was Octavio Moran. Very poor referee, it has to be said. He let a lot of fouls on both sides go, missed a lot of things. Not exactly the strongest referee in the world, but Mike Tyson, Buster Douglas wasn't given a long count. He wasn't, and you hear that all the time nowadays. You heard it in the first Wilder Fury fight. Oh, he was down for longer than 10 seconds. It's not 10 seconds, it's a flat 10 count. And it's the referee's count, which is final. It's not the timekeeper's count. It's not a stopwatch with 10 seconds. It's the referee's count. He's the one who makes the decision. The only reason James Douglas, there's 2 reasons, right? One, it was the very end of the round. Like literally when Douglas got up, the bell went. Alright, when Tyson was dropped, it was early in the 10th round. He'd taken an absolute beating. A horrible beat. Tremendous beating from James Douglas, and he was out of it. Absolutely out of it. You could never have allowed Mike Tyson to continue. The mouthpiece was in backwards. If the referee had let Mike Tyson continue, he would have got knocked out cold. He would literally have been, it would have been dangerous. He would have been absolutely ironed out badly by Buster Douglas if the referee had let him continue. No way. Could not let that fight carry on. And there was something else I was going to touch on about that Buster Douglas fight. It slipped my mind now. God almighty, I've forgotten now. There was something else about that Buster Douglas fight. Oh yeah, the lack of preparation from the corner. I mean, at this stage he was trained by Jay Bright and Aaron Snowell. He'd fired Bill Caton. Didn't really like Bill Caton. And Aaron Snowell, Jay Bright, the advice they gave Tyson in the corner wasn't exactly great. They didn't have anything prepared. They had no end swell to try and, because Mike Tyson's eye was swelling quite bad. I think it was his left eye, and it was swelling quite bad. They had no end swell to even try and, calm the swelling down. So they got a glove, filled it with water, and it was the most tragic thing you'd ever see. And they're holding it to Tyson. It's not going to do anything. It was literally not going to do anything. Mike Tyson came back 4 months later against Henry Tillman. This was at Caesar's Palace, and this was actually co-feature with Bob Arum and Top Rank. So it was Don King and Bob Arum. You had Mike Tyson, Henry Tillman, amateur rematch. On the undercard you had George Foreman versus Adelson Rodriguez on that undercard, because they were kind of talking about, I remember at the time, just before Tyson lost to Douglas, you had George Foreman who fought Jerry Cooney, and he was on, was it Letterman, the late night with David Letterman, and he was saying that he was next for Mike Tyson, so there was that. Obviously at this time Mike Tyson was meant to fight Evander Holyfield actually after he beat Buster Douglas, providing people thought he would beat him. So Holyfield got that shot. Mike Tyson then went on to fight Alex Stewart. That was a good win. Stewart was a real slow starter. He was dropped early in several fights. Like Foreman had him up and down a few times early on, but Mike Tyson was very quick starter. Was able to get rid of him. The Tillman knockout's a highlight reel knockout. He really messed Henry Tillman up big time in that fight. Then he fought Razor Ruddock. Now, Ruddock was tough. He was game. Didn't have a lot of technique. Had good power in the left hand, but that's about it. In that fight, he was stopped in the 7th round. Honestly, I've seen that fight. By today's standards, I don't think anyone would really complain. But by 90 standards, yeah, I can kind of see where they were coming from with that they were a bit PO'd about that. So then they had a rematch only 3 months later. Now this fight was bizarre. If you look at the scorecards, they're quite odd. 113-109, 114-108, 114-108. Yeah, Tyson had Ruddock down a couple of times. It was a real messy fight. Tyson didn't look good in that fight at all. He looked much better in the first one. He really did. He didn't look good at all in the second Razor Ruddock fight, and it was a bit all over the shop. But Ruddock at that stage had gone 12 rounds with Tyson. People thought at the time, that's incredible. What a feat. You went 12 rounds with Tyson? Mike Tyson? And that's why many people were picking him to beat Lennox Lewis. So when Lewis came in and wiped him out in 2 rounds, the next thing was, he's just finished from what Mike Tyson did to him, and Mike Tyson's never the same after that. That's what they say about Donovan Razor Ruddock. I don't think Ruddock was alright. He wasn't in the right home about. This was in 1994. He was meant to fight Evander Holyfield. Didn't happen. Mike Tyson ended up in, how do I put it for YouTube? He ended up in a spot of bother. That's what we'll say. With a girl called Desiree Washington. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs with this. Go watch a documentary on Mike Tyson, because I don't want to get this video demonetized, because even using that word, which Mike Tyson was convicted for, is really, that will have consequences on this video. I'm not going to say that. But Mike Tyson to this day says he's done terrible things to women. Terrible things he'll take to the grave. But he didn't do that. And Desiree Washington, I definitely think there's holes there. I mean, you're going to Mike Tyson's hotel at 3 o'clock in the morning. What did you think was going to happen? And apparently she'd made accusations about that to other people, her own dad even, apparently, allegedly anyway. So there's a lot of issues with that whole Desiree Washington thing. But Mike Tyson, he said himself maybe this was retribution for some, because he said by his own, he'd done terrible things to women, but not that. Some of them he'll take to the grave. God only knows what that is. God only knows. So he was gone for a few years, and at that time, the heavyweight division was kind of all over the shop. Lennox Lewis was seen as, okay, Lennox Lewis is coming, he's got the WBC title. Oh, he got knocked out by Oliver McCall. Bo is good, but he's up and down, in and out like that. There was a famous designer called Sarah Beanie in the mid-2000s. I think she was on Room to Improve or something like that in the UK. And I remember every time you'd see her, she'd be in, she was out, she's pregnant, she's not pregnant, pregnant again. Bit like that with Bo. He's in, he's out, he's in, he's out. That's kind of how it was with Bo. He was always gaining weight. Holyfield was a cruiserweight. This is what how the press in America were with regards to some of the heavyweights at the time. Holyfield was a cruiserweight. Foreman was old. Moore had no chin. Kind of stuff like that. Morrison had no chin. We need Tyson back. That was the kind of thing. So, I'm talking a lot. I should have brought water for this. He came back, obviously, in August 1995. Fought Peter McNeely. Mike Tyson, that's a famous one, the stare down. The Mike Tyson stare down, where it's just like that. And Peter McNeely with that big, kind of simple looking head, just kind of, hey yeah. That kind of head, that kind of look. And yeah, Mike Tyson beat the crap out of him in the round. Got DQ'd because the corner jumped in to stop it. That was kind of an anticlimax. It really was. I think that was on pay-per-view as well at the time. That was a real kind of anticlimax to that fight, because many people felt like, we waited this long to see Mike Tyson and then this happens. Now, interestingly, because a lot of people were unhappy about that, his next fight was going to be against a guy called Buster Mattis Jr. Buster Mattis Sr. was a heavyweight contender in the 70s. Had real trouble with weight, real bad problems with weight, did Buster Mattis Sr. I think when he died, he was nearly 500 pounds. Now, Buster Mattis Jr. was alright, could not break an egg. I mean, we're talking Chris Algieri kind of style puncher, can't crack an egg. That was Buster Mattis Jr. But this fight was on Fox. I think this was on free to air, as a kind of throw you a bone for the Peter McNeely fight being so bad. And apparently this done all crazy viewing figures. Crazy. So Mike Tyson didn't look amazing against Buster Mattis Jr., has to be said, but he got the job done in 3 rounds nevertheless. And then he went in to face Frank Bruno. This is for the WBC World Heavyweight title. So Mike Tyson against Frank Bruno. Now, against Bruno, the first time around, Tyson done okay. Went to Bruno's body, and that was really what spelled the end. Bruno in this fight was 247 pounds. He was 20 pounds heavier than he was in the first fight, and it really showed. Bruno, I think, had seen better days at this stage. Mike Tyson, see, some people were saying at this stage that Mike Tyson was better than he was in his prime, and a lot of people were saying that. They were saying he was hitting harder out of prison. Everyone except Teddy Atlas. Teddy Atlas felt that Mike Tyson, he was missing something. Now Atlas, although he hadn't been in Tyson's team for many years, I always got the impression that he knew Tyson probably better than any coach, maybe even better than Kevin Rooney. He really knew what he had. Teddy Atlas is an interesting character. As a trainer, he's a good trainer, but he's too in your face. But he does seem very kind of switched on to the mental aspect, and I reckon he really probably got to know Mike Tyson, the Mike Tyson, when he was training with him as an amateur, and he was probably able to tell. He could tell what was going on there. So anyway, Mike Tyson's champion again. He's WBC champion. Then goes, I think, he actually vacates that title. Goes on to fight Bruce Seldon. Now, Bruce Seldon was WBA champion at the time. Knocked Bruce Seldon out and around. Bruce Seldon, right? Bruce Seldon was athletic. He had a good jab. If you'd watch Bruce Seldon against a journeyman, you think this guy is very good, because he did look good against them kind of fighters. Now, I know you could say it's easy to look good against it. Yeah, it is, but you'd see the attributes Seldon had. He was a good fighter. Only issue was he really had it. Well, he had a lot of issues with Bruce Seldon. He really did. He wasn't the biggest heavyweight in the world. He had a questionable punch resistance, and he suffered from anxiety. And in this fight, I think people said he had an anxiety attack in this fight because the shots he was getting hit by were pathetic. You know, they weren't devastating shots. He was play acting a bit. I think the first knockdown the punch didn't even land. Bruce Seldon was looking for a way out of there. Like, he had a similar experience against Riddick Bowe, but he actually took shots against Bowe before going down, whereas in this fight he seemed to just freeze. People were saying, did he throw the fight? And Seldon was like, I trained for 12 weeks. Why would I throw the fight? I mean, it really was a kind of shambolic show, but Mike Tyson was WBA champion. This was actually in September, and then come November 9th, 1996, he fought Evander Holyfield. Now, Holyfield at this stage, records there 32-3. Holyfield had lost to Michael Moore. He'd lost the first fight to Riddick Bowe, came back and won the rematch, and then he lost to Michael Moore. That was an upset. And then he was stopped by Riddick Bowe. Many people felt that, well, it was down to Holyfield discovering a heart condition. Some people feel that heart condition came about because Holyfield had help getting up to heavyweight. You know, maybe that was a result of it. Whatever way it was, Holyfield had seen better days. The fight before he fought Tyson, he fought Bobby Ches. Bobby Ches was a commentator. Still, Bobby Ches doesn't really commentate anymore. Which is not a bad thing, because he's a horrible... People talk about Sky being biased and DAZN being biased. Bobby Ches was the biggest Mike Tyson fanboy you'll ever meet. I mean, I'll give you an example. Francois Botha, when he fought Mike Tyson, you go and watch that commentary. Oh my God. Bobby Ches is only short of getting in the ring and, you know, Mike Tyson. That's how bad it is, to the point where the other people like commentary are saying, Botha was fighting a great fight. What are you talking about? Never liked Bobby Ches. Don't think he's a good commentator. If he still does commentate, not really my kind of cup of tea. One of my least favourite like, people complain about Matthew Macklin. Matthew Macklin's better than Bobby Ches. Well, certainly when it comes to Mike Tyson favoritism, yeah, he's better. Definitely. I mean, it was crazy. But Holyfield had looked pretty shocking. He hadn't looked good at all. I mean, I think Buster Douglas was 42-1. Holyfield was 25-1. Imagine them odds. Imagine how much money you'd have made on Evander Holyfield to win that fight. And yeah, how old would I have been? I would have been 3 years old at the time when this fight happened. Obviously, I wasn't watching boxing back then, but if I'd have been around, I would have been thinking, say a prayer for Holyfield. If I'd have been the same age I am now then, with a fight like this, I'd be saying, say a prayer for Holyfield, given no chance. I've watched that fight several times, the first fight. I always watch it with Reg Guttridge and Jim Watt. But you can get that. If you type in Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield 1 Sky box office, you'll get the Sky commentary. It was Jim Watt and Reg Guttridge. Perfect. That is literally like... I know there's I think it's the Showtime feed where you can watch that as well. But you won't get a better one than that. I mean, Jim Watt, Reg Guttridge, that is just the perfect combination of commentators. Ian Dark and Jim Watt is good too. But yeah, Reg Guttridge was brilliant. And people like Mike Costello. I wonder why I don't. There you go. You listen to guys like Reg Gutrich and Jim Watt together, it's very hard to come close to that. It's a brilliant fight, and again, I say made all the better. If you've never seen it with their commentary, it's brilliant. It really is. I mean, them two just captivate you. They really do. But as for this fight, it was a brilliant display from Evander Holyfield. Dropped Mike Tyson with a good... See, Holyfield was able to get in under Mike Tyson. And that's how he was able to drop him. Because that pick-a-boo style, you're basically... It allows you to get hooks and uppercuts off a lot faster, a lot sharper, right? But your head is kind of moving like on a pendulum. And if you're caught kind of square on, you will be off balance. Now, on the Sky feed, they said it was a hook to the chin. It wasn't. It was kind of to Mike Tyson. It was a knockdown, but it was a knockdown to Mike Tyson's chest when he was off balance, and it put him down. Now, that Mike Tyson wasn't hurt, but you could really see he knew kind of at that stage Holyfield wasn't going to be denied. Holyfield was kind of rocked early on in the fight in the first couple of seconds, but he got back over that, was hit by a good shot in the 5th round, and that was really it. That was all Mike Tyson really had. After that, it was Holyfield just putting the beating on Mike Tyson. The 10th round was brutal, where Holyfield absolutely landed a Hail Mary right hand on Mike Tyson. Holyfield and Douglas are the only two people to really proper hurt Mike Tyson. And I mean really hurt him. Really hurt him. And that right hand, Tyson was finished the end of the 10th round. He was absolutely out on his feet. Holyfield finished him off then in the 11th round. No complaints. Stoppage was perfect. Tyson was never, ever, ever going to survive that. Holyfield had enough energy, enough stamina, and was able to get rid of Mike Tyson. Came into the rematch, was a bit lighter, looked in good shape, but the damage was done psychologically to Mike Tyson from the first fight. And I think in that first round, he realised, crap, it's gonna go the same way as the last fight. And that was when we had the famous biting incident. Mike Tyson went in, came into the third round with his mouthpiece, bit Holyfield's ear, and was subsequently disqualified. Mills Lane, I will never forget Mills Lane, where I think Mike Tyson said, you know, I didn't do or something, and all you hear, Mills Lane had a very distinct voice, and you just hear some, you know, BS. He said, so he didn't see, he used the full abbreviation, but you just hear Mills Lane. Mills Lane was a good character. He was a very good referee. What was it? Let's get on. That's what he used to say. Yeah, Mills Lane was great back in the day. Yeah, I remember Mills Lane. Yeah, right guys, let's get on. He has a different voice than that, but I remember Mills Lane was good. So Mike Tyson was suspended thereafter, rightfully so. Came back against Francois Botha. Honest to God, right, he looked a little bit shot in this fight. He really did. He didn't look like himself. He looked, he did not look right against Francois Botha, and he was losing that fight. Botha fought a very, very good fight. Fought an excellent fight, actually, let's be frank. He fought an absolutely brilliant fight against Mike Tyson, up until he was caught with that short right hand. Yeah, he was never going to get up from that right hand. Mike Tyson, actually, when Botha he lost the fight, the count was done, but as Botha was trying to raise, Mike Tyson was able to hold him. Jack Dempsey used to do that to opponents when he used to knock them out back in his prime. Orlin Norris, that wasn't in the UK, because it was the Julius Francis fight, which was in the UK, promoted by Old Fish Eyes, because Mike Tyson, I think, was having trouble getting light. Was it? No, I think it was something to do with him having issues in the States, and he had that fight in, where was that? That wasn't the Hampton. No, that was in the MEN, as it was known at the time, against Julius Francis. Francis was down a couple of times in that fight. The Lou Savarese fight, which was in Hampden Park, referee John Coyle knows all about that fight. Lou Savarese was kind of like a fringe, a very poor contender, it was have to be said. He'd been beaten by guys like George Foreman. He actually, ironically, when Buster Douglas was on the comeback, he stopped Douglas in a round. Buster Douglas was shot beyond pieces at that stage. But he was down early on in the first round. Mike Tyson gave him a beating, and when the referee stopped it, Mike Tyson wouldn't. He claims to be high on a certain drug, the old, how you doing? That was what he was on, allegedly. Well, he says himself he was on it in that fight, and he had ways of circumventing drug tests. So that's how he was able to get away with that. But yeah, he said he was on that, and he fought like someone who was. He was absolutely like a man possessed in that fight. Then he fought Andrew Gallotta. We're near the end. We're coming near the end now, actually, people. Jesus, this was quick. I've been talking for a while now. I've been talking for well over an hour now, actually. That's why I had to take a break midway through and get a drink of water, because I'm chatting. I think I've been talking for well over an hour. I think this video, God knows how long it's going to take me to edit this video. But yeah, fireworks to be expected in that fight. I can imagine what people thought, because Galata, very volatile, very erratic character. Mike Tyson, we know. Yeah, it was pretty straightforward, to be fair. Galata quit after, what was it, 3 rounds? 2 rounds? Well, was it? Yeah. Galata really didn't want to know. Yeah, I think that was the fight anyway. He was down a couple of times. It was changed to a no contest. Mike Tyson tested positive for marijuana. I mean, it's hardly a performance enhancer, to be fair. Maybe that's why he was kind of lackluster in it. Then he fought Brian Nielsen. Brian Nielsen, I think, was Danish. Was a Danish heavyweight. He amassed a very impressive record of 62-1, but he really fought nobody along the way. Mike Tyson beat him. This was a career heaviest at the time, was 239 pounds. Mike Tyson was lifting a lot of weight at this stage. You got to bear in mind, you have a 5'10" guy coming into the ring at 240 pounds. It's not going to work well. It's not going to go well for him. After that fight, he fought Lennox Lewis. This was for the, Unified, because Lewis didn't have the WBA at the time. I think Ruiz. No, was it? Yeah, Ruiz would have had it at the time. And yeah, he fought Lennox Lewis. I remember the build-up to this fight very, very well. How old was I? I was about 8 years old at the time. I remember the build-up to this fight. It was all over Sky at the time. This is when we started getting Sky TV in Ireland quite cheaply. So I remember the build-up very well for this fight. I had no idea who either guy was, but I remember it was all over the news here in Ireland. Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, and I remember, I don't know who it was, but I'll never forget. It's one of the earliest boxing memories I have. Someone picking and it was a journalist. It was a sport. I don't know who it was, because I don't remember the name, but they picked Mike Tyson to win in 3 rounds. I remember that. I don't know who it was, but I remember hearing Sky News, Mike Tyson will win in 3 rounds. He'll knock Lennox Lewis out in 3 rounds. I forget who it was. I don't know who it was, but I remember it very well. Hearing that. I had no idea who Mike Tyson was, but I just remember hearing about it. Everyone was talking about this fight at the time on the news and on the TV. Yeah, Lewis beat the living crap out of Mike Tyson in that fight. Tyson was good for all of 90 seconds. Came out swinging in the first round. Got hit by an uppercut from Lennox Lewis, was hurt, and that was really him on the back foot. He was trained by Ronnie Shields in this fight. It was really, Mike Tyson had nothing left. And even when he got knocked out by Lennox Lewis, it was kind of like, I'm sure he felt the shock, but he wasn't out of it like Douglas style or Holyfield style. He was just kind of like, I'm not getting up. That's kind of how it was. Lewis was older than Tyson, but he still had way fewer miles on the clock. Lewis, his style was built to last. Just sweet science, good boxing, keeping it range. Tyson's was a young man's style, and he just wasn't the same anymore. We fought Clifford Etienne. Sad story about him. He's been in and out of prison. I think he's still in jail now. Knocked out in the first round. Bill Clancy said it was the hardest shot he's ever seen. That was in the same arena where he was knocked out by Lennox Lewis. And just a little bit of trivia, I think Manny Pacquiao was on that undercard, the Tyson Lewis undercard. Could you imagine Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis, Manny Pacquiao all on the one card? Crazy. It's just because I don't think anyone expected Manny Pacquiao at the time, 2002, to be the star he would be. But yeah, he was on that undercard as well. Here we go, the last 2 fights. Danny Williams in 2004. Mike Tyson had money issues at the time. Well documented issues with money. He'd lost an awful lot. Promoted by Don King, it's not going to endear you to a rich life. I mean, ask most fighters. But against Danny Williams, started off extremely fast, extremely strong, but he hurt his knee. And that's legit. He did genuinely hurt his knee in the first round. And by the 4th round, Danny Williams landed some bombs on Tyson. He went down, kind of sagged again the ropes. And it wasn't a look of days. It wasn't a look of I'm hurt. It was a look of, how have I ended up here? 20 years prior was just before he turned pro. But all the hype in the world on this kid. And 20 years later, I'm just sat stumped here on the ropes. How did this happen? And then in Tyson's last fight, he fought Kevin McBride. To call Kevin McBride a fringe contender is really generous to McBride, because McBride was garbage. He really was. Just a big... He's from Monaghan, is McBride. But even then, even then, when he was fighting Tyson, he had well-documented alcohol abuse issues. You know, I mean, this guy was a raging alcoholic even then, McBride. So for Tyson to go in there and lose to him, and you know, Tyson tried to break McBride's arm in that fight. He was really dirty in that fight. Yeah, I mean, if you'd showed someone from the late 80s images of McBride training and fighting, and you said this guy's gonna beat Mike Tyson, they would send you into like the nearest mental institution they could find. You know, that's kind of McBride. So yeah, Tyson had nothing left at that stage. He was trained by Jeff Fennett, I think, in that fight, and at that stage, Mike Tyson, it was done. You know, you could argue he should have really maybe left after Clifford Etienne, at least go out on a win. He needed the money, but he had nothing left at that point. So Mike Tyson ended 50-6 with 44 knockouts. You know, since then he's done cameos in movies like The Hangover. You know, that was actually a good little cameo. I think Mike Tyson's vegan now, if memory serves me right. Has his podcast, done that exhibition last year at Roy Jones. It's funny, right? When he uploaded those footages of him hitting the pads in anticipation for that, the amount of people who thought Mike Tyson could make a comeback and win a world title was crazy. It baffled me that people actually thought that could happen, because I've just reviewed his entire career. The man lost to Kevin McBride 16 years ago, and people thought that he could actually win a world title today. Crazy. McBride would have been a journeyman in any era. In any era, McBride would have been battered from pillar to post. I mean, could you imagine McBride around today? Dubois would beat him, Yoka would beat him, all the top guys would beat him. There'd be a lot of guys who probably wouldn't even fight him, because they'd be like, what's the point, he's too easy. No disrespect to McBride, but I'm just being real. And people thought Mike Tyson could do something. No. But Tyson's career, it's fun to look back on, because it was a fun career. I think that Mike Tyson was one of these guys where it all came about at once, and it just went very, very quickly. You know, he rose to fame, he rose to the heights very quickly. He couldn't stay there long term, and when it went down rapidly, like roller coaster down. Like it was like a roller coaster that was going down, and it wasn't going back up, it was staying there. That's the best way I can describe it. Tyson was one of the funnest, most explosive, most dynamic heavyweights you'll see. Some people will say he's the hardest puncher of all time. I certainly don't agree with that statement. I think it was the speed. A lot of people, like Brian Nielsen, have said that it wasn't the punching power. He wasn't feather-fisted, he hit hard, but the speed was so sudden and so ferocious that, you know, when he hit you, you wouldn't see the shot coming, and you were kind of dazed before you even knew what hit you. Whereas there was a lot more concussive punchers at the time, you know, than Mike Tyson. But the speed was something else. But, you know, if you put Tyson, a prime Tyson in today's era, he's having a hard time. You know, people say, like, you know, oh, Tyson today, he beat all these guys. He beat Usyk, he beat Fury, he beat Joshua. And yeah, I agree, he beat some of the guys, but do I think he beat all of them? No. I think that you need to look at, like, Mike Tyson never fought a 6'5", you know, 240 odd pound Anthony Joshua, who's athletic. He never fought a 6'9" gangly Tyson Fury. You know, stylistically, that's just something different. You know, look at James Smith, look at Buster Douglas, look how they were able to keep Tyson at bay by just keeping him at range and then tying up when he came in close. You don't think guys today could do that? They could. They absolutely could. But looking back at Mike Tyson's career, it's a strange one. People say, like, if he'd never left Rooney, if Cus D'Amato hadn't have died, ifs and buts. Larry Holmes said after he fought Tyson that Tyson was always going to end up like this. It was just a case of when, not if. He knew there was something in him. It was in him to go down this road. And I have to say, that statement that he says, when I look back at people I've known in my life, personal life, I think there's a lot of truth to that statement, because I've seen people I went to school with who, even back then, some of them came from good families. You could just see They were always going to go. It was almost like it was written before they were born. That you could just tell they're going to go down a certain road, and it's not a good road, and it's going to end in tears. And it did. And you can see that with what Larry Holmes just knew it. He's seen what Tyson was there. He was like, this guy's going to destroy himself. And in many ways he did. You know, I mean, he let Don King, you know, get into his ear, tell him what he needs to do. The Robin Givens thing wasn't ideal for Mike Tyson. The Desiree Washington situation was, you know, what it was. And, you know, that, and incorporate that with a style that has a shelf life. You know, that it's a real young person style. People who say Mike Tyson will be 100-0 with, you know, 100 title defenses, no, he wouldn't. And I think that a prime Tyson had his flaws. I think a prime Tyson would have lost. And I think in the grand scheme of things, we got to look at a prime Tyson and say, you know, he done well, but, you know, the era that he was fighting in was not exactly the strongest. Has Mike Tyson, when he passed it, did he get any ATG wins? I would say no, because Holyfield was past him when he fought Tyson. He beat him. That's an ATG win. Lewis was past him when he fought Klitschko. Still an all-time great win. Ali was past him when he fought Foreman, when he fought Norton, when he fought Frazier. You know, there's other examples. I'm just trying to think of others. God almighty. Joe Walcott was past him when he fought Ezra Charles. You know, these guys have all got wins, good wins, when they've passed it against, you know, top opponents. Mike Tyson, you can't say the same about him. And hey, look, I love Mike Tyson. I love watching Mike Tyson, but I'm just being real. Nothing you can, everything I'm saying, that's fact. You know? So when we look at his career, we talk about it. Do I think it could have been any different? I don't think it could have. I think that, yeah, Mike Tyson could have been a bit smarter with his management maybe and not let someone like Don King in. But in terms of him losing, I don't think he ever would have been undefeated. I think like Douglas would have always given him issues. Holyfield would have always given him issues. Lewis would have given him issues. If they fought in the 90s, Lewis would have given him hell. Today, you know, Vitali, you know, if you're talking about the 2000s, would have given Tyson issues. Vlad would have. He would have. I know people say, Vlad's chinny. Yeah, he's chinny, but look what he did to Povetkin. I mean, Povetkin is no Mike Tyson, yes. But look how he's able to just neutralise these guys instantly by holding and leaning. You don't think he could have done that to Tyson? He could have. Definitely. So, it's an interesting topic. I mean, Mike Tyson is someone who has that aura about him. You know, you talk about him in these fantasy fights. You know, what about Tyson and Ali? What about Tyson and Foreman? What about Tyson and Fury? You know, what about Tyson and Wilder? You know, you have all them little fantasy fights, and you know, you'll go back and forth, and you'll I've had that many times where you go back and forth with friends, and you'll say strengths of Tyson, but you'll say strengths of Ali, and you know, Usyk if you want to. What about Tyson and Usyk? Well, Usyk can do this, but Tyson can, you know, it never ending. It's always good fun. But Tyson's career been fun to look back on. It's been a roller coaster of a career, and it's been a lot of talking. An awful lot. So for now, lads and lasses, I'm going to leave you with that. If you could, please, I would appreciate you smash the like button. I've been talking for an awful long time. You boys really went for it this time. Hope you liked it. If you all could, smash the like button. Help your boy out. Get the subscribes going. I'd love to hit 6k by Christmas. Let's try it. Let's see if this video can do it. Hope you liked it. Peace.